Mhm.
So, Jan, very welcome to this Metaforum webinar. Very happy to have you with us and to listen finally to your talk that we were hoping to listen in the conference in Leuven and didn't manage to do it. So, looking forward to see you. I will appreciate if you just summarize, introduce yourself a little bit to the participants, and also let us know if you would prefer to do the whole a presentation first, or if you would prefer to be interrupted and take questions all the way through. Okay?
Mhm. Now, you can certainly interrupt me at any moment, but please take into account when I project my slides, I cannot see any one of you and also not see whether questions are asked in the chat or not. So Angela or John, if you would like to follow up on the questions in the chat, just interrupt me when they pop up.
Yes, we'll do that.
Okay, so I'm Jan. I always say I have a threefold identity. I'm a professor at the Catholic University of Leuven, where I teach organizational and human capital, and that enables me to look at the relationship between how companies structure themselves and let their organizational structure evolve at the one side, and at the other side, their organizational growth. I'm working with an investment fund that asks me to do a kind of an organizational and human capital analysis following the question, will this organization be able to execute on the business plan that they propose and where they ask funds for? So that's my academic part. I'm following up those companies. I am a very lucky person in the sense that the investment fund does not always follow my advice. And so I have already situations where I gave negative advices and where, based on their financial analysis, they invested, but it turned out wrong. So, and I take a systemic perspective on assessing the, I would say, the viability of an organization. And I'm very much inspired by Stefan Beer, but also by the work levels approach developed by Elliot Jack and his followers. My second identity is that I'm managing director of Connect and Transform. That's a boutique consultancy. We mainly help organizations through transitions where we focus on the interrelationship between organizational structure, their processes, and the human capital component. And the human capital component is also part of my study work in the sense that I focus on the type of and patterns in decision making that people take, and at what layers in a company do people take, well, how do they come to good, holistic, integrated decision making? And that's where my consultancy circles around. And my third identity is that I'm a chief ecosystems officer of a very small software house, Dynamic Collaboration. And we have developed two tools that enables an organization to assess the viability of the structure, the quality of the structure, and the quality of the human resources setup. It's focused on getting clear how roles are designed one against the other in their relationship, and how accountability for processes is taken. As you know, the Tayloristic approach focuses on tasks to be done, on fragmenting an assignment in different specializations, and looks for ways to get those activities coordinated. We all know that the Tayloristic approach, the Ford model, does not work. But the Toyota model, which focuses on self-organizing structures, also doesn't work, because both neglect the systemic components in their setup. And the dynamic collaboration application helps you to create what I say healthy structures, and helps you also in seeing how your structure can evolve and how it supports your organizational growth by looking at the complexity themes in roles and the type of complexity handling of individuals. So that's what we do in dynamic collaboration. We are at this moment with 11 and growing to 20. So it's a very small venture. But today I was asked, and I will start my presentation, to share some thoughts on just a moment. That's my mailbox that you see. That's not the... So you should see my presentation. Is that correct? Coherent action, linking role and work contributions to each other through real-time dialogue.
Yes.
Yesterday, yes, is there a question?
No, it's all right. It's just saying it's all right.
Okay. Yesterday, I was also invited in another circle, and the starting question they asked me in presenting myself, and I found that a very good question, was, what were your main inspirational sources that formed your ideas up till now? And my response was that basically I have four inspirational sources in the beginning of my career when I did my when I worked at my doctoral thesis as a researcher at the University of Leuven. We followed up innovation processes in 7 companies over a period of 3 years. And we were very much inspired by the appreciative inquiry approach developed by Suresh Srivastava, Ron Fry, and David Cooperrider from Cleveland University. And what I learned from the appreciative inquiry approach is that you can look at organizations from a very analytical perspective, let's say a diagnostic perspective, but there is always another dialogical perspective present in cooperation, and especially in putting the advices that follow from a good diagnostic into practice. So there is always a challenge to find out what type of dialogue will enable to put the ambitions, the aspirations, the conclusions out of the diagnostic approach into practice. And that's where I'm basically going to talk about. The second inspirational source was when I was HR director. At a certain moment, I was HR director for worldwide for 108 companies worldwide. And I was also a board member of the board of owners of the company. So not only the group management team, but also the board. And it was in that context that I needed to restructure a lot of operations worldwide And I searched worldwide for consultants that could help me and support me. And I got across Gillian Stamp, who was a student of Elliot Jack, the work levels approach. And so I got my own diagnosis of where I was in my own complexity handling versus how I organized the complexity in my own departments. So I had direct reports in each continent. And as a young man, I was in the beginning of my 30s then. I found it not so simple to get things organized, and the work levels approach helped me to see clear. At that time, I was not familiar with Stafford Beer's work, but Elliot Schack's work enabled me to develop a systemic perspective on how to get things organized. And it especially pushed me in the direction of looking at the fractal or layered nature of things, not only in organizations, but all over in nature. So everywhere you have layers, and you need to think through how you come to coherent action by using a kind of a model that helps you see the layering and helps you to deal with the layering. And that's the second aspect I will talk about. When I started, in the second half of the 90s, I was asked, there was a chair at our university. At that time, it was a human resources. They looked for somebody who wanted to take over the human resources subject. But at that moment, I was still in an HR director's position. So they looked at me. I had kept contact with the academic circles, and I was a practitioner. So they found that I could easily take over that subject. But at that moment, I had a kind of an existential crisis in the sense that I found that most of the competency approaches that I used and that underpinned the human resources setup. So competences were used to recruit people. They formed the basis for remuneration systems. They were guiding all types of developmental and leadership development initiatives. And well, I started to see that a lot of things that people did in the human resources domain did not work, did not have any impact. And at that moment, second half of the 90s, I was also president of the Professional Federation of Organizational and Human Resources Professionals in Belgium. And so I set up working groups, learning groups, groups of practice to see whether colleagues shared my skepticism on the emerging methodologies. And at that moment, I came across the work in adult development that invited me to look at how people dealt with complexity and how they made sense of their reality. One of the persons that inspired me most was Otto Lasker. And at the same time, I had gone through several reorganizations, and I also met Luc Hoebeke, who was a great fan of Stafford Beer. And I got across his book, Making Work Systems Better. And so I had several conversations with Luc, and what he tried to do was linking different systemic approaches into a kind of a unified model. But what he missed was the developmental part. And I started to experiment with the combination of both. And that led me to the discovery of another domain, and that was complexity theory. The work of especially Michael Jackson and Eve Middleton Keller, who was a colleague of mine teaching at the London School of Economics, and now she teaches at Cambridge University. And she helped me make the link with complexity theories and the phenomenological, the philosophical approaches behind those theories. So what I will present today is a kind of a simplified integration of those four sources of inspiration. The third pillar, the constructive developmental pillar. I'm now very inspired by the work of Gilbert Simondon, a French philosopher who went much further into looking into how people deal with complexity, and especially how people grow in their complexity handling. So that's a bit my inspirational source, or these are my inspirational sources. The title Coherent Actions and Linking Role and Work Contributions to Each Other and Through Real-Time Dialogue is mainly inspired by the latest English book that I wrote together with Otto Laske with the title Practices of Dynamic Collaboration. It appeared in 2020 and was published by Springer. But I added a number of insights which I shared in the book published in February this year, but it's only available in Dutch at this moment, with the title, There is no collaboration without co-reflective thinking. I decided not to translate that book, but immediately to write the follow-up book in English, which will be on humane organizations. And that's essentially the quest that I'm on. Namely, can we find different types of organizational models that enable individuals, teams, and organizations, but also the environment, the societal dimension, grow in ways that are respectful to one another. But more of that in my next book. Coherent work, coherent action was also Stafford Beer's quest, in the sense that when I read his books, what came to the surface for me was that he tried to define a model that enables us to handle complexity better. At least that's my simplified interpretation of Stafford Beer's quest. Of course, he did much more than this, but that's for me what comes to the surface. And what I found absent in his books was that the most important thing is not the analysis of the system that you're making, but what you are not talking about systemically if you are discussing the system, like the king in this comic, he walks by a wall and sees, and so be it, and asks himself the question, what a stupid sentence to write on a wall. But he doesn't see the whole picture. And my experience in working with a lot of systemic thinkers is that they all master a number of systemic thinking categories or classes, but they rarely master the whole range of systemic ways of systemic thinking. And there are multiple ways of systemic thinking. If you go back to the Maya culture, they had at least some 1,028 ways to look systemically at nature. We, in our Western culture, we are happy when we can distinguish 5 systems or 6 dimensions or 5 drivers. And so we are always missing some elements. If we draw maps, and what you see here is the map of Europe as used in the north of Africa in the Middle Ages. So you see in the middle of the picture Spain of Europe, and you see the Red Sea, the Black Sea, and basically what is on top is the Orient. And I often use that map to highlight that we must be always aware that we do not confuse the maps that we use with the reality, because every map that we use, also Stefan Beer's map, is reflecting a kind of a world view, and linked to that world view a level of maturity and thought fluidity. And every world view, or most of them, luckily, are rich, ambiguous, and unique. They are personal. And we need to be able to look at maps and to connect our maps. Even when I'm in circles with several systemic thinkers together, I often see that they talk one beside another. We all know Stefan Beer's map. He distinguishes 3 elements, and for him, a system in the most simple form is a collection of elements that interact together. And he distinguishes the environment, he distinguishes operations, and he kind of has a conception of a meta-system. The operations, he often compares that with the different organs in our body. Each organ functions autonomously. In business, we know that those operations can be product lines, can be geographical regions, can be client groups. We have very different ways. It can be technologies, different ways to organize our operations. And an operation always answers a need in the environment. You always need an environment to have an operation that makes sense. It's the environment that makes that gives meaning to the operations. Stefan Beer labels that as system 1. We all know that, and you need a system 2 to coordinate those operations in order that they become self-organizing. Stefan Beer was not focused on hierarchies at all, but asked himself the question how you can organize a kind of layering, a kind of a stratification in which each stratified level operates in a self-organized way. But in our body, but also in organizations, you will always need a system that regulates the attribution of resources and the tensions between the different system ones. He calls that system 3. And you have a system 3, system 1, 2, and 3 basically focus on managing the present. And Stefan Beer rightly said, well, you also need a system 4 that looks into the future and identifies new opportunities in the environment. And, well, he pointed rightfully to the tension between systems 3 and 4. And you need a system that enables you to keep things together, the identity system. As far from here, I hope I said nothing new for none of the participants. I simplified it in the dynamic collaboration application in the sense that in each role and each function in the organization, you need to have a system 1 part, a system 2 part, a system 3 part, and a system 4 part. And if you look at the current reality in many organizations, a lot of function descriptions and role descriptions, they miss one of the 4 key accountabilities. And so the roles in itself are not designed in a viable way. But this is the starting point that Stefan Beer offers in his book. And the essence is that, and I will try to have this, the essence is what helps us to map stratification, because you have those operations at different levels woven into one another. And here the combination of, so you have the operations and the meta system in each of the operations, and depending on the system in focus, you will have different conversations. And the conversations that I started to distinguish one from one another are the quality and service contribution theme. Often this is the theme of the people with direct contact with the client, who need to operate within a given set of rules and procedures, often best practices. And what is asked there is that they comply with the best practices up to that moment, and they need to coordinate themselves. In the word coordination, there is the word order and discipline. But of course, quality and service in every company is embedded in a contribution theme of continuous improvement. And that's in nature the next level. That's the level where different professional expertises, which you find quality and service, around quality and service is organized around professional knowledge, and different professionals need to be aligned. And the essential conversation here is a cooperation conversation. It's a conversation on the modus operandi, where different professional expertises get aligned one with one another. The quality and service contribution theme and the continuous improvement contribution theme rarely embrace systemic thinking. If you look at, for example, the Agile movement or the Lean or the Six Sigma approaches, which are heavily focused on continuous improvement, they say that they want to handle the system, but they basically structured their activities around quality and service snippets, not being able to bring the whole system into a room. The real systemic thinking starts to appear in many organizations in the operational flow and value stream domain. That's the domain where you have different silos, and you need to organize the flows of information, of resources, of people, of financials across units, across team borders. And there is a kind of an integration that needs to take place. And that's where real systemic thinking comes to the surface. And it goes through a kind of a co-construction dialogue. Most of you are probably familiar with brown sheet exercises that enable you to do this, to kind of visualize the system and the interaction. That's a co-construction dialogue. But that co-construction dialogue is always embedded in a dialogue that circles around new future business models. You could say that the quality and service is often the layer of people immediately providing services to clients. The continuous improvement domain is often the domain of the team lead. The operational flow is often the middle management, and the new future models is often the CEO level. And so in most organizations, you only need 2 layers between the people working at the bottom of the organization and the CEO, the top. When the CEO does not focus on new future model, or when the co-modeling or designing dialogue doesn't take place, you will get into problems in the organization. And what you started to see in the last 5 years are companies that started to operate in an ecosystemic way, one another, weaving their activities in kind of open innovation, co-evolutionary processes. And so this is inspired by the work levels approach. It actualizes the work levels approach, and it combines it with Stefan Beer's work. And this is important because it helps you to see through traditional organizational charts. We are all familiar with charts such as the one here on the left, but looking at it from a contribution perspective, you can measure the complexity theme in the sense that here all the colors reflect different complexity themes and different types of conversations that need to be carried out. When you draw contribution-focused organizational charts, and the dynamic collaboration application enables you to do it very quickly, you can, for example, see that if a project management office is designed at a higher, more encompassing complexity level than the service head, that the real steering of the group will be by the project management office. You also see that the distance between team leads and service heads is too big. In the system here that we developed, we found out through research that the optimal distance is between 0.6 and 0.8. So when the service head is fully operating in the new profitability domain, while a team lead is at the high end of continuous improvement, there is a kind of a gap and you will get siloization in the company. But you can also predict where, based on a structural analysis, where conflicts between different people will occur. And that has nothing to do with behavioral strengths or weaknesses of those persons, but it is embedded in the structure. For example, if there is an inverse relationship between the team lead and the professionals, well, that team lead will not have any authority to organize the work of the professionals. The professionals, even stronger on the right, will neglect the team lead, or the team lead will be pushed in an administrative role. So the Steffert Beer's work, combined with the work levels approach, helps you to see the relationships, or to bring to the surface the real functioning of the organization and the real functioning of the stratification within a company. All those things combined help you understand the type of decision-making, whether or not there is micromanagement, or whether or not responsibilities get unclear. For example, the three types of professionals have a very different weight in terms of their unique contribution. So if you put those professionals into a room, the 3.4 professionals will talk on a different wavelength than the 2.4 professionals. And even stronger, the senior professionals will not have authority on the professionals on the left. And that leads to suboptimal decision-making, creating rework, but also form the reason for an increased turnover, an undesirable turnover in companies. We know that at each level, and that's a huge value add, there are 7 conversations that appear. There is a conversation, if I start at the bottom, between the operational cell and the environment, whether the services or the products that they provide are still meeting client expectations, and it's about how stable the operations are. You have a second dialogue, which has to do with the monitoring component, the red line with the 3 asterisks, that are all the systems used in an organization to check whether or not the operations kind of make good use of the resources that they get. It's a kind of an audit function. But you also have the dialogue that is on coordination, which is the tension between the system 2 and the system 1. You have the resources bargain dialogue, the adaptation dialogue, the scanning dialogue, and the identity dialogues. And you know, development happens when people start to feel the tension between the contribution focus that they are working on and the next higher up contribution focus. we could stop for a minute here and reflect on the question, well, how do really those 7 conversations differ between, for example, the quality and service domain and the continuous improvement domain? Because you have the 7 conversations in a different way in those different contribution themes, or between the continuous improvement domain and the value stream domain. I don't know whether the question makes sense for you. Have you ever thought about the fact that those conversations are different? Because the moment you start to understand how they are different, you start to understand why budgeting techniques that are uniformly used in an organization often do not work, or why certain practices work at one layer but not at another layer in an organization. Yeah. Xavier, do you have...
want an answer now?
Well, you can answer now, or if you need more time to reflect, I will continue to build further upon the ideas that I introduce.
I like the term you're using, conversations. Usually, I think more on interactions. It's not only conversations, but yes, conversations sounds that. And yeah.
It are conversations which guide the type of interactions.
Saying.
Wait, I do not understand. I haven't understood your question or your reflection. Well, let me just continue with the line of thinking. And I will take a small sidestep at this moment. A small sidestep to better understand the type of conversations that appear in the different domains. And please take into account that each of the contribution themes, I gave it a specific color. Orange for the quality and service domain, green for the continuous improvement domain, blue for the operational flow and value streams domain, violet or purple for the new future model domain, and gray for the integrated ecosystems domain. And here I will integrate the findings from cognitive developmental psychology, and they brought to the foreground that throughout adulthood we develop our thinking as adults, starting from a kind of a single expert thinking, a kind of a professional thinking that is taught in most business schools. I only know one school, namely Schumacher College in the UK, in Cornwall, that does not teach expert thinking, or that does not produce graduates that are specialized in a specific type of thinking. But the expert thinking is kind of what we get from our education. And during our professional career, we start to experience that there is more than logical, analytical thinking. There is also part-whole thinking, or thinking how something is really fitting into a larger picture, and being able to point to the specific relationships between the part and the whole. And that evolves further into dynamic thinking. Dynamic thinking is about hypothesizing how things evolve, how they evolved in the past, but what new pictures you can build, what new interpretations you can build, reinterpreting the past or the future and the present, and how you can see dynamic patterns evolving. A lot of the first systemic approaches focused on making sense of feedback loops, single loop learning, double loop learning, and triple loop learning were examples of dynamic thinking. And that evolves further into coherence thinking. Coherence thinking is focusing on the real nature of the relationships and the structures of what you bring into a relationship. And that evolves further into metamorphosis thinking. Now, given the colors, what I see through applying the dynamic collaboration tool, and we measure the types of thinking so that we can align that. The types of thinking inform you about the type of complexity handling by the person, and you need to map that with the complexity theme that needs to be handled in a role. And if you're able to do a matching, you increase the probability of success. If people function within a complexity theme where their own thinking is not up to handle that complexity, they get into a risk zone of burnout. And when they are able to do more than what is expected from them, they risk to move into a kind of a bore-out situation. But besides cognitive development, which enables you to look at the ways of thinking about the world in each of the thinking classes, you have 8 different patterns of thinking. So you have or 7 different patterns of thinking. So you have at least 28 patterns of thinking that help you to think differently from logical analytical thinking. And you need to you're able to have meaningful dialogues and come to integrated decision making if you guide the conversation towards a higher degree of integration of different types of thinking. But the second dimension where cognitive developmental psychologists looked at were identity development issues and the motivational field from which one operates. For example, people operating from an instrumental way or from an instrumental script, they put their own ego before everything else. They often oversimplify things because they believe that by oversimplifying, they will be able to control things. But in adulthood, but unfortunately that does not happen with everyone. You can have a president of the United States that remains operating from a very instrumental, egocentric point of view. I will not name Trump as an example. But most people develop into dependent or other dependent ways of operating, where they are heavily focused on getting recognition, being a team member, being respected as a team member. And that kind of colors how they think systemically. They will only think systemically within the borders of the systemic thinking of the group with whom they identify. At a certain point of time, people move into self-authoring, putting their own boundaries again on the table, and they function from their own values in which they try to integrate other people's values. So they are not egocentric anymore, but they are really focused on finding common ground and a good solution. And then you have self-aware phases. I won't go into the detail of this because I can talk for more than an hour only on the details of those models, but I want to present them because if you have a challenge, for example, in the value stream V-space, you can have a team that mainly operates from the orange point of view, which is the single expert thinking. Or you can have a team where the complexity handling is aligned with the complexity team. And the developmental diversity of the team will determine how the systemic conversation will unfold. We can measure these dynamics. That's what basically the dynamic collaboration application enables you to do. It's because you have developmental diversity that tensions between the different contribution teams start to appear. And it is in discussing those tensions and in observing those tensions that you will be able to stimulate the development both of individuals, of teams, and of organizations. And to make it very simple, and again, this is really oversimplifying things, in the continuous improvement domain, you will always have a tension between the coordination people and the cooperation people. And the moment the coalition within the team shifts to the coordination of the stabilizing of the joint action, you will have a narrowing dynamic coming to fragmented decision-making, while if they go into the cooperation dynamic, you can come within the continuous improvement domain to really more integrated decision-making. But that presupposes that the expertise of the people that operate in the coordination logic gets transcended. And you need to have an insight in how to influence the thought structures of people present in the room. Within the value stream domain, you have the tension between co-construction and cooperation, which you can observe And in the new future model domain, you have the tension between co-construction and co-modeling. So if you really simplify it, from those 7 conversations, what most dominates, and I'm here simplifying the 7 conversations, but the resources conversation is most prevalent in the tension between continuous improvement and value streams. The type of planning, whether it is project, program, or portfolio planning processes, is most present in the interrelationship between the new future model domain and the value stream domain. And the modeling discussion is very much present in the interface between new future models and the ecosystemic co-weaving. So if you have decision making that goes to the left, I label that as a narrowing dialogue, where you will see that from the 7 conversations, only 1 or 2 will dominate the dialogue. It will often circle around best practice and by definition exclude options. That's where the thought structures are often focusing on relatively simple cause and effects, and where the complexity is reduced to the parts. The broadening dynamics, you get them when you're able to open up the thinking, invite people to share their ideas on emerging practices. And it starts with examining their own thinking. So that means that they start examining how their own thinking, even as systemic thinkers, contributes to certain dialogues or makes other dialogues more difficult. I don't know whether you have, if you look back at recent conversations, systemic conversations that you had, whether or not you recognize the narrowing and broadening dynamics that happen in meetings. Narrowing means that the subgroup that goes from for the less encompassing mechanism versus the subgroup that goes for the more integrated perspective. And have you ever wondered how you could kind of influence those shifting coalitions which take place in meetings? Does it resonate what I'm sharing here?
I say yes, very much.
Mm-hmm. Any other reactions or questions at this point?
I would like to comment that I like your approach very much, because I have often thought one thing, that the functions by Stafford Beer and the model are systemic functions. And by systemic, I mean that identity is present in every other function at the same time. So all the functions are present everywhere, all the time. Okay?
That's correct.
So when you draw the ovals, one within the other, this points to the way that the viable system itself is built. When you are getting together to create a business, your identity is accepting all sorts of variety. And when you start planning, you start cutting down variety, okay? And the last phase of the cutting of the variety is when you produce a product with certain qualities, certain characteristics, and that's the product, okay? That's what's going out of the factory in a box. The variety is cut down to 0. You have this gadget, whatever it is, and it performs a function that is like an amplifier for somebody else, but you are very specific. So you start in the viable system with a lot of variety, potential variety, and you get down to the product which has the variety it needs and no more, okay? So when you combine this idea with your ideas of how the conversations have to change, I also think that we need to start teaching people to think in terms of variety, because when you have a clear idea of how variety works, then you can say what type of conversation you're having. You want to cut down the variety, you want to design the perfect spoon, let's say, or you are trying to create a new type of spoon where you have this dynamic of broadening the variety, going back to re-explore what you're doing.
Would you say that it makes sense to distinguish different patterns in handling variety within the quality and service domain versus the continuous improvement versus the value stream domain?
Absolutely, because when you are in the quality, in the lowest part of your graphic, the variety of the product is settled, okay?
Yeah, indeed.
It is what it is, okay? But then you can bounce back to another domain where you re-examine whether the variety you're...
Yeah, your mic is off. We cannot hear you anymore.
Sorry. What I was saying is that I see this a very valid conversation, what you're talking about, because it's all a variety that's being cut down from the identity to the last product, where you define the product. You have all the constraints are there, okay? A product has all the constraints that you wanted to fix a certain problem, okay?
Yeah.
So then that means
I see that
it's
also
a
you
variety
only
game.
yeah.
You can go back to a higher level and explore and broaden the scope, and maybe you can reinvent the product and make it do some other things, okay?
And the key will be how you talk about the variety and what kind of thought structures enable you to have a meaningful conversation of the variety. You can look at the variety from a functional perspective, but you can also look at the dynamics that create variety, or you can look at the critical relationships within the variety. And these are all perspectives that need to be combined and turn out differently in the different layers of complexity.
So you can understand, if you're not using requisite variety to think about these problems, it is very difficult for people to reach agreements, because one might be working on broadening and the other guy might be working on constraining.
Yes, that's correct. And that's the type of dynamic that we need to focus on, or that I learned to focus on in order to create progress in the dialogues.
So
you
the
also had
VSM
a
is
question.
like a funnel. When you start with a lot of variety at the top, and then you go all the way down to the product you are actually shipping, where the product has the variety, it solves the problem that it's solving the way it is doing it, but that's like variety zero. Okay, that's your product.
I found personally the variety concept a concept that enabled me to look at differences, but I did not find it very helpful to make it practical in my consultancy work. That's why I started to distinguish really different types of thinking and include the developmental part, the individual development part, and the upward and downward dynamics that take place in teams. I see two other people also have raised their hand. Jonli, you were first.
And then Marcus Schoninger.
Yes.
Hi. I would like to take the discussion to a higher level as opposed to a level of detail that I think Javier did a great job of discussing. So I happen to be fascinated by Elliot Jacks. Peter Tuddenham would do a much better job of representing him than I can. But the main point I want to make now is when someone has been working for 6 months and they have 3 people below them that are rookies, they know, she knows more than the subordinates do, but doesn't know very much about why. When you work for a year, then you've got 10 subordinates, you have a much better idea of why you're doing what you're doing. When you work 5 years, you have a span where you're looking a year into the future and trying to anticipate what it is that people are going to need a year from now. When you've worked 10 years, you've got an idea of what the organization is really capable of. That's the scale that Elliot Jacks is talking about. When you have the level of detail, you can go down, but you don't have the capacity to go up until you have the life experience. I think Elliot Jacks is a great idea, and I recommend that you explain him better than I did.
Thank you, John.
I agree. Thank you. Marcus.
Yes. You mentioned Elliot Jacks as one of your core elements of your basics, as one of your bases for your work. And at the same time, you advocate the principle of Stafford Beer, the self-regulation, a systemic approach to coping with complexity, etc. Now, Elliot Jacks, he wrote this paper called "In Praise of Hierarchies," and I see some incommensurability between the two approaches. How do you bring that together?
Well, Elliot Jacks' ideas were developed some 50 years ago in an industrial company. And if you look at the current setups of companies, both big companies and small companies or medium-sized companies, you see that the type of layering has changed, that the concept of time span, as Elliot Jacks put that forward. So his 7 layers of stratification do not match anymore with the current reality. If people start working in a company as an engineer, they are immediately forced to take a perspective of 2 years, but they are doing quality and service related work. So there is something that does not match anymore. And what I did I kind of reformulated, redefined those levels in examining within Elliot Jacks' work, how can I not only distinguish the 5 systems at each level of stratification in Elliot Jacks' work, but what is the more encompassing layer adding to the layer below. And when you do that exercise, you will see that there are overlaps and that Eliot contradicts himself at a certain point. But he did a great job in pointing to the layered nature of coherent action, like Stefan Beer does. So I focus on what they have in common in order to integrate the two perspectives. And it is so that on average, each higher level layer embraces further looking into the future, bigger whole of complexity to be managed, a bigger set of tensions to be coordinated, and so on. But Stefan Beer never was able to really point to the essence of of how systems or how different layers were nested one into another. And Eliot never managed to distinguish really the coherent system at each layer of stratification. So, but if you combine both, you have the best of both worlds. And you need to integrate then developmental psychology, which Eliot started to do, but he was building on the work of Piaget and the first findings of how people develop their thinking in adulthood, which were focused on logical thinking development based on the IQ tests that were intensively used in the 60s and 70s. But now you have very different types of tests that really focus on creating clarity on how one really deals with complexity and shapes a perspective on things. The traditional IQ tests start from uniform definitions and from one right answer, where in reality there is no uniform definition and there is no one right answer. So you really need to be able to understand how people make sense of those stratified levels. And that is really giving you the insight into how conversations unfold in companies and how coherence is really taking shape in real life.
Thank you.
We have a Raúl Espejo wanting to ask a question.
Thank you, Angela. I think Stanford did connect the embedding of systems from the very high levels to the very local levels. Perhaps the 2 points that come to my mind are first, this you talk about narrowing and amplifying also the discussions, the conversations, and I would like to have examples of that, so that you tell me in practice how is it that you have handled this narrowing or this increasing of situational complexity. But perhaps the second point is more saying there is no real issue of going from the very global to the very local, reducing the complexity from very large complexity to, as I think one of us said earlier, to one product that is all. I think in general, these conversations and amplification happens at all levels. And that is what is the notion of recursion that is very much handled by Stanford's model. So Have you made use of the notion of recursion? Do you recognize that, in fact, the complexity at the bottom level is very large and not just single product that goes out? Is simply something where you have conversations at the local level, very large conversations, and also that goes to the multiple layers and levels. So my general view is that I didn't get very clear how you handle the levels of the layers, and how do you handle the problems starting from the very global to the very local.
Let me look for an example just to illustrate it. I'll take an example of last Monday, where a company created a process library and a model of a master data library behind it, so that if there occurs issues in the company, for example, a client that does not follow the procedures, that asks specific services or products, what I saw in the company is that if one silo takes on the challenge and adapts, for example, it was a client that asks to print labels for sending packages, a seemingly very simple thing. But it was not clear whether those labels should be printed by IT, the service desk in the customer experience department, or that sales should print those labels. And just a shortcut was taken, and IT was asked to print the labels. While doing that, they changed some things in the software, and they did not see that it influenced the invoicing. For example, all the packages that client shipped were not invoiced. It influenced the sales because they did not have any clue of the new business that the client was doing with them. It also appeared that in the master data, that specific question of the client did not go back to certain data categories. And so what you had was that someone with the best intentions does something in an organization, does not orchestrate or think through the influences, and thus narrows the issue. And what is needed then is a system to think through whom to put in the room. What is the system that I need to put into the room? And making a distinction between the quality and service, the continuous improvement, and the value stream domain helped enormously the person to think through the labeling question in the 3 layers of contribution. And the moment he or she starts to act as a process integrator in the value stream domain, it becomes very easy to bring the proper people into the room and take a decision and have a right conversation. So what I'm doing is through helping people think through their real contribution in the right level of stratification, you will automatically come to an alignment of the different operational levels in the organization, and you will build recursion in practice. But I don't know whether that example resonates with you.
Well, it does resonate, I think, but at the same time, I'm wondering about self-organization. How is it that self-organization takes place at all these levels? So what does it mean to have self-organization? I like the idea of bringing into the room all these people and discussing the issues that they have to handle. That's very useful and very good. The next point I am asking is, how is it that self-organization takes place there? How is the relationship between the different levels and the self-organization of the components? Have you experienced that? Have you made use of that idea?
Well, I'm doing nothing else than that because my point of departure and the self-organization that happens at different layers is differently because the type of conversation, those 7 conversations which I pointed to, are different in each of the contribution themes, in each of the complexity themes. So how one
are they different?
talks.
Are they different in the sense, what is the connectivity between them? What does it make them part of an organization?
What happens, what needs to be, well, what I experience that helps me is that at the next higher level, one has to deal with the complexity of that level and with the kind of bringing to the surface the tensions at the underlying level so that the underlying level can handle those tensions, whether those are tensions in the domain of adaptation, of coordination, of planning, of resources bargaining. How it turns out is different at the different layers of complexity. And that's because people think differently. And I describe that extensively in my book, Practices of Dynamic Collaboration, how the thinking differs in those different contribution domains.
Well, thank you very much, Jan and Raul, for a really interesting conversation. And we have only 5 minutes left, and Elena has been waiting to have a question. Elena?
I think one of the things that I used when I compared Elliot Jack's work to Stafford's is that Stafford's is very context neutral in that the recursive levels don't necessarily need to depend on authority, as the Elliot Jack's work seems to be quite rooted in the original context that he worked in, which was factory work, where you don't have a lot of ambiguity around how far ahead you have to look. And we had examples like the Millennium Bug, for instance, where if everybody was in the room, somebody would have said, hey, the year 2000 is coming up. And so I was struck by the fact that the difference in the breadth of context that can be dealt with by the VSM versus the breadth of context where you need to really do some essentially adjustment with the Elliot Jack's work, because sometimes at the very low level, you need somebody who's thinking 20 or 30 or 40 years ahead.
Yeah, that's very correct. And that's, I can only agree with what you're saying. And that's why I kind of redefined Elliot Jack's work. So the different complexity themes, namely quality and service, continuous improvement, value streams, new future models, and ecosystemic collaboration or integration. You can find that in peace work. For example, yesterday I had people in the session who were attending a peace conference in I don't know, I don't recall where it was just, but you have those different themes in non-governmental organizations, you have them in non-profit organizations, you have them in profit organizations, you have them in small, you have them in big companies. So I fully agree that you need to decontextualize Elliot's work. And Steffert Beer helps you to decontextualize Steffert Beer's work, Elliot Jaques' work.
Well, thank you, Elena, and thank you very much, Jan. I think that it has been really interesting. We could stay here for another hour discussing. I think that you open a field of research that is very important and really exciting and very complementary. I mean, really developing Stafford's work in the level of cognition and linking it with individual development and organizational development in very interesting way. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully we'll see you next month. Next month we have Paul Pangaro. It's not going to be on a Wednesday, it's going to be on a Friday because it was the only time that he could do it, and it's at 4 o'clock UK time. So hopefully see you on a month. Thank you very much.
Okay, and thank you for the questions and the remarks. So see you in another
it was a very
context.
nice contribution to the VSM. A lot of substance in there, and we need that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan.
Bye.
Thank you, Angela.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.